The village of Thalorn was a place hidden deep within the craggy peaks of a mountain range that stretched as far as the eye could see. Surrounded by towering trees and thick, dark forests, the villagers lived a life of quiet simplicity, tending to their crops, raising their livestock, and passing down stories that wove together their rich history. For centuries, the village had stood against the test of time, resilient through seasons of bitter cold and harsh winds, through droughts that left the rivers dry and the fields barren. Thalorn had survived it all, but there was one legend that sent a shiver down the spine of even the bravest souls. It was the tale of the Drakmir, a creature so terrifying, so ancient, that it had almost passed into myth. But the elders, those who had lived long enough to remember the signs, knew better. They knew the Drakmir was no myth. It was a being of immense power, a living nightmare that slumbered deep within the mountains, waiting for the right moment to rise once again. The village had not seen the Drakmir in generations, but the warning signs were etched into the collective memory of Thalorn's people. Kael, a humble farmer, had grown up hearing the stories. He had heard the tales whispered by the fire at night, his grandfather's gravelly voice recounting the horrors the Drakmir had wrought upon their ancestors. Entire fields scorched to ash, livestock torn apart as if by a monstrous wind, and those who had the misfortune of seeing the beast well, they were never seen again, or worse, returned broken, unable to speak of what they had witnessed. But the Drakmir was a thing of legend, a tale to keep children from wandering too far into the woods at night, or so Kael thought. He spent his days tending to his farm, walking the same paths his ancestors had walked, believing that his village would always remain untouched by the world beyond the mountains, until the signs began to appear. At first, it was subtle, a low, ominous rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth, like the growl of some enormous, slumbering beast. The villagers dismissed it as nothing more than tremors, the kind that sometimes rippled through the mountains. But soon other signs followed. The river that flowed through Thalorn, the lifeblood of the village, began to slow, its waters growing murky and strange. Birds that had once filled the air with their songs now fell silent, as if they knew something terrible was coming. Then came the cold and unnatural, biting chill that settled over the village, despite it being the middle of spring. The crops, which had been thriving, withered in the fields overnight. A darkness hung over Thalorn, heavy and oppressive, as though the very sky itself was waiting for something terrible to happen. The villagers gathered in the town square, their faces pale and drawn with fear. They whispered of old legends, of the Drakmir, of the destruction that was sure to come. The elders, their faces etched with the wisdom of years, stood grimly at the center of the crowd. The Drakmir is awakening, one of the elders said, his voice trembling with age and fear. The signs are clear. It stirs in its lair, and soon it will come for us. Panic spread through the crowd like wildfire. Some villagers spoke of fleeing, of abandoning the village that had been their home for generations. Others argued that they should send for help, though no one knew who might come to their aid in such a remote and isolated place. Despair threatened to overwhelm them, the weight of the impending doom pressing down on their hearts. But Kael, who had stood quietly among the crowd, listening to their fears and doubts, felt a fire ignite in his chest. He had always been a man of quiet determination, never one to seek the spotlight or boast of his strength. But now, in the face of this growing terror, he knew he could not stand idly by. Stepping forward, Kael's voice cut through the chaos. "We cannot run," he said, his tone calm yet commanding. "If the Drakmir is coming, it will find us no matter where we go. This is our home, our land. We must defend it as our ancestors did before us." The crowd fell silent, eyes turning toward Kael. He was not a warrior, not a leader, but there was something in his words that steadied their nerves. For a moment, the panic receded, replaced by a flicker of hope. But how? A voice called out from the crowd. "How can we fight something like the Drakmir? We are farmers, not soldiers." Kael's jaw tightened. He had no grand plan, no secret knowledge of how to defeat such a creature. But he knew one thing. Courage wasn't about having all the answers. It was about standing up when it mattered most. "I don't know," Kael admitted, "but we can't face it blindly. I will go to the mountains. I will find the Drakmir's lair, learn what I can, and find a way to stop it. We cannot rely on anyone else to save us. It falls to us to protect our village." The elders exchanged worried glances, but there was no denying the truth in Kael's words. The village council convened, and after much deliberation, they agreed to support Kael's mission. They gave him supplies for the journey, food, water, and an old relic that had been passed down through generations. It was a shard of stone, etched with strange symbols, said to hold the power of the mountains themselves. The relic was a last hope, a connection to the ancient magic that had once protected the village from the Drakmir. And so, with the weight of his village's survival on his shoulders, Kael set off alone into the mountains. The journey was long and treacherous. The higher he climbed, the colder the air became, the winds howling through the jagged peaks like the wails of lost souls. The trees grew twisted and gnarled, their branches blackened as though touched by some ancient curse. The ground beneath his feet was rough and uneven, the path barely visible through the mist that clung to the mountainside. Days passed, And the further Kael went, the more he felt the oppressive weight of the mountain bearing down on him. It was as if the land itself was warning him to turn back, to abandon his quest. But he pressed on, driven by the thought of his village and the people he loved. He couldn't let them be consumed by the darkness that lurked within the mountains. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of climbing, Kael reached the highest and most dangerous peak, the one where the Drakmir was said to dwell. Before him stood the entrance to a massive cave, its mouth gaping like the jaws of some enormous beast. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and from deep within the cave came a low, menacing growl that sent a chill down Kael's spine. The air here was thick with the stench of sulfur, and the darkness that seeped from the cave seemed almost alive, shifting and pulsing like a living thing. Kael took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Torch in hand, Kael entered the cave. The walls were slick with moisture, and strange, jagged formations jutted out from the rock, casting eerie shadows in the flickering light. The deeper he went, the more the air seemed to thicken, growing colder and heavier with each step. And then he saw it. The Drakmir. It lay coiled in the heart of the cave, its enormous, scaled body stretching across the cavern like a serpent from the deepest pits of the earth. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, were closed as if in deep slumber, but its breathing was slow and rhythmic, each exhale sending a wave of heat through the cave. Kael's breath caught in his throat. The creature was far larger than he had imagined, its massive body covered in thick, black scales that shimmered like obsidian in the torchlight. Its claws were as long as swords, its teeth like jagged knives. Even in sleep, the Drakmir exuded a palpable aura of danger and death. Kael knew he had little time. The beast was stirring, its slumber nearing its end. He had to act quickly. He pulled the relic from his pack, its surface glowing faintly in response to the presence of the Drakmir. The elders had told him of its power, but Kael had never truly believed in such things until now. He held the shard aloft, the ancient symbols etched into its surface beginning to pulse with light. Kael whispered the incantation the elders had taught him, his voice trembling as the words of the long-forgotten language filled the cavern. The ground beneath his feet began to shake, the very air around him crackling with energy. The Drakmir's eyes snapped open. With a deafening roar, the creature reared back, its enormous body twisting and coiling in the confined space of the cave. Its eyes locked onto Kael, burning with rage and malice. The ground shook violently as the Drakmir lunged, its massive jaws snapping shut just inches from Kael's head. Kael staggered back, the relic flaring with a blinding light as the Drakmir's claws scraped against the stone floor. The beast let out a scream of pain, recoiling as the relic's power surged through the cavern. But the Drakmir was not defeated. It roared again, its voice echoing through the mountains, a sound so terrible it seemed to split the very sky. Kael could feel the creature's rage, its hunger for destruction, and he knew that if he faltered, if he hesitated even for a moment, the Drakmir would tear him apart. With every ounce of strength he had left, Kael continued the incantation, his voice rising above the creature's deafening roars. The relic blazed with light, its power coursing through Kael's body as the ground around them began to crack and crumble. The mountain was responding. With one final, desperate push, Kael thrust the relic toward the Drakmir. The cave erupted in light, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The Drakmir let out one last, blood-curdling scream as the mountain itself began to collapse around it. Rocks tumbled from the ceiling, the ground split open, and the walls of the cave came crashing down, burying the Drakmir beneath tons of stone. Kael barely escaped, running for his life as the cave crumbled into ruin. Behind him, the Drakmir's roars faded into silence, the mountain sealing the creature in its ancient prison once more. Exhausted and battered, Kael made his way back to Thalorn. The villagers greeted him as a hero, their faces filled with awe and relief. The Drakmir, they believed, was finally gone for good, thanks to Kael's bravery and the power of the ancient relic. But even as the village celebrated its salvation, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that the Drakmir was not truly defeated. The mountain had sealed the beast away, but it still lived, buried beneath the earth, waiting. And though it might take centuries, or even millennia, Kael knew that one day the Drakmir would stir again. But that day, he hoped, would not come in his lifetime. For now, the village of Thalorn was safe, and Kael had earned his place in its history as the man who had stood against the darkness and lived to tell the tale. But the shadows in the mountains remained, watching, waiting, biding their time. The village of Thalorn had returned to its peaceful existence, yet there was an unspoken tension lingering in the air. Though the Drakmir had been sealed beneath the mountain, the memories of the beast's power and the devastation it had once wrought still haunted the minds of the villagers. Despite the celebrations that followed Kael's heroic return, the elders of the village remained cautious. They knew all too well that the mountain had a way of keeping its secrets, but they feared those secrets wouldn't stay buried forever. Kael, once a humble farmer, had become a legend in his own time. His name was spoken with reverence, and children who once ran through the village square without a care now looked up to him with awe and curiosity. He had saved them all, yet Kael himself felt uneasy. Despite the cheers, the praise, and the relief that washed over the village, Something within him told him that the Drakmir's defeat was not as final as everyone believed. He could still feel the creature's presence, like a distant echo in his mind, a malevolent force biding its time beneath the earth. Life in Thalorn returned to its regular rhythms, but Kael's own existence became one of watchfulness. He kept to his farm, tending to his crops as he always had, but every night he would climb the hills overlooking the village and stare at the mountain where the Drakmir had been entombed. The once imposing peak now appeared to be a silent sentinel, its jagged ridges casting long shadows in the fading light of dusk. It was as if the mountain itself was keeping watch, waiting for something Kael hoped would never come. Years passed, and Kael aged along with the village. His hair grew streaked with gray, and the strength of his youth began to fade, but he never stopped his nightly vigil. As time moved on, the memory of the Drakmir's terror began to fade from the collective consciousness of the villagers. A new generation was born, children who had no memory of the dark days when the signs of the beast's awakening had sent tremors through the village. For them, the story of the Drakmir became just that, a story, a tale to be told by the fire during long winter nights. But for Kael, the reality of the beast was ever present. His dreams were haunted by visions of the Drakmir stirring beneath the mountain, its eyes glowing with ancient malice. Sometimes in the dead of night, he would hear faint tremors, subtle but unmistakable, as if the earth itself was whispering of the evil that lay dormant within. Yet, each time he checked with the villagers, they would dismiss his concerns as the ramblings of an old man burdened by memories of a long-gone threat. One night, as Kael sat alone on the hillside, watching the mountain in the pale light of the full moon, a strange feeling crept over him, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. It was a chill, not from the cool night air, but from something deeper, something unnatural. The earth beneath him trembled ever so slightly, and for the first time in a decade, Kael felt the familiar, low rumble of the Drakmir stirring. A sense of dread washed over him. He knew what this meant. The beast was awakening again. Kael rushed back to the village, his heart pounding in his chest, though his body was slower than it had once been. His mind was sharp, and he knew that there was no time to waste. The Drakmir's return was inevitable, and this time, he feared the village might not be so fortunate. The elders, now older and frailer than ever, gathered in the town hall to hear Kael's warning. Their faces, etched with lines of wisdom and worry, betrayed their own unspoken fears. They had known, deep down, that the Drakmir's imprisonment was not permanent. But after so many years of peace, it had been easier to hope that the beast would never rise again. We felt it too, Kael, one of the elders admitted, his voice a whisper of age. The mountain has been speaking to us in our dreams. The Drakmir is stirring, but we do not know how long we have before it breaks free. Kael looked around the room, seeing the uncertainty in their eyes. We have to act now, he urged. If we wait, it will be too late. The relic we used before. The relic was a one-time use. Another elder interrupted, shaking his head. Its power is spent. We have nothing left to seal the Drakmir away. A heavy silence filled the room. Kael's heart sank. He had hoped that the elders might have some hidden knowledge, some forgotten secret that could save them once again. But it was clear that this time they were unprepared. We cannot wait for the Drakmir to come to us, Kael said, his voice firm. If we do, we will be destroyed. We must go to the mountain. We must stop it before it can awaken fully. The elders exchanged wary glances. What you are proposing is madness, one of them said. The Drakmir's lair is a death trap. If it is stirring, venturing into its domain will only provoke it. Kael knew the risks, but he also knew there was no other choice. We can't wait for it to destroy us, he repeated. I'll go alone if I must, but I need to do something. We cannot stand by and hope that the mountain holds. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence. I will go with you. Kael turned to see a young man, no more than 20 years old, standing tall and resolute. His name was Bryn, the son of one of the village's blacksmiths. He had grown up hearing tales of Kael's bravery and had always admired the man who had saved the village. Now he stood ready to follow in his footsteps. If you are going to face the Drakmir, then you will not go alone, Bryn said, stepping forward. I may be young, but I know how to fight. My father taught me well, and I'm not afraid. Kael looked at the young man, seeing in him a reflection of the courage and determination he had once possessed. Are you sure? Kael asked. This is no ordinary fight. The Drakmir is no mere beast, it is a force of destruction. Bryn nodded. I am sure. I cannot stand by while my home is in danger. I will fight for Thalorn as you did. Kael smiled, though his heart was heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Then we will go together, he said. The elders, seeing that Kael and Bryn were resolute in their decision, finally relented. We will prepare what we can, one of them said. But if the Drakmir awakens before you return, we may have no choice but to evacuate the village. Kael and Bryn spent the next day gathering supplies, torches, weapons, and what little knowledge the elders could provide about the Drakmir's lair. As they prepared for the journey, A sense of quiet determination settled over the village. The villagers, though fearful, knew that Kael had saved them once before. They placed their hope in him and the young warrior who stood by his side. The next morning, Kael and Bryn set off toward the mountain. The trek was harder than Kael remembered. His joints ached, and the cold bit at his bones, but he pressed on, knowing that time was against them. Bryn, full of youthful energy, moved with the vigor of a man on a mission, his eyes scanning the horizon as they ascended higher and higher. Days passed, and the closer they came to the mountain's peak, the more Kael felt the weight of the Drakmir's presence. The air grew thick and heavy, the shadows deepened, and the ground trembled beneath their feet with increasing frequency. Finally, they reached the entrance to the Drakmir's lair. The once gaping cave had partially collapsed, its entrance jagged and uneven, as if the mountain itself had tried to seal the creature inside. But even with the rocks and rubble, there was a sense of movement beyond the darkness. The Drakmir was stirring, and soon it would awaken fully. Kael and Bryn entered the cave, their torches casting flickering light against the walls. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the stench of sulfur and decay. As they descended deeper into the lair, the ground shook violently, and the faint sound of the Drakmir's breathing grew louder, a rhythmic, rumbling exhale that reverberated through the stone. At the heart of the cave, they found the Drakmir. The beast was even more terrifying than Bryn had imagined. Its massive body, coiled and stretched across the cavern floor, was covered in thick black scales that gleamed in the dim torchlight. Its claws were like blades, its teeth like daggers, and its eyes glowing with a faint, sinister light were slowly beginning to open. Kael held his breath, knowing they had precious little time. We need to find a way to stop it before it fully awakens, Kael whispered. There must be something here, something we can use. Bryn nodded, scanning the cavern for any sign of a weapon, a tool, anything that could give them an advantage. But the cave was barren, save for the Drakmir's massive form and the jagged rocks that lined the walls. As the Drakmir's eyes flickered open, its breathing became more pronounced, and a low growl rumbled from deep within its throat. The beast was waking, and soon it would unleash its fury. Desperation surged through Kael's veins. He had faced the Drakmir once before, but that had been with the power of the relic power that was now spent. He had no plan, no magic, nothing but his will to fight and protect his village. But then something caught his eye. Along the far wall of the cavern, partially hidden by shadow, was an ancient stone altar. Upon it lay a large obsidian blade, etched with runes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Kael's heart leaped. This must have been left by the ancient guardians who had once sealed the Drakmir away. That blade, Kael breathed. It's our only chance. With a nod, Bryn rushed toward the altar, his hand reaching for the weapon. As his fingers closed around the hilt, a surge of energy coursed through him, the blade coming to life in his grasp. Kael watched as Bryn lifted the blade, its weight heavy but manageable in his hands. The young warrior's eyes gleamed with determination. As the Drakmir began to rise, its monstrous head turning toward them, Kael knew that they had only one chance to strike. Now, Bryn, Kael shouted, his voice echoing through the cavern. With a fierce battle cry, Bryn charged toward the Drakmir, the obsidian blade raised high above his head. The beast let out a deafening roar, its massive claws swiping through the air as it tried to crush the young warrior beneath its weight. But Bryn was fast, his movements quick and precise. He dodged the Drakmir's claws, weaving through the shadows as he closed in on the creature's heart. Kael watched, his heart pounding in his chest, as Bryn leaped into the air, the obsidian blade glinting in the torchlight as it came down with all the force of his strength. The blade pierced the Drakmir's scales, sinking deep into its flesh. The beast let out a scream of agony, its body writhing in pain as the ancient magic of the blade took hold. Bryn held fast, driving the blade deeper into the creature's heart. For a moment, the cave was filled with the sound of the Drakmir's death throes, a sound so terrible it seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. The ground trembled, rocks fell from the ceiling, and the air grew thick with dust and debris. And then, silence. The Drakmir lay still, its massive body collapsed upon the cavern floor. The glow in its eyes faded, and the once unstoppable force of destruction was no more. Bryn, exhausted but victorious, pulled the blade from the Drakmir's heart and staggered back toward Kael. It's done, Bryn said, his voice hoarse. The Drakmir is dead. Kael, his heart swelling with pride and relief, placed a hand on Bryn's shoulder. You did it, he said. You saved us all. Together, they made their way out of the cave, leaving behind the body of the creature that had once terrorized their ancestors. The mountain, now silent and still, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as they emerged into the light of day. When they returned to Thalorn, the villagers gathered to greet them, their faces filled with awe and gratitude. The Drakmir was finally gone. Its reign of terror ended once and for all. Kael, now an old man, smiled as he looked out over his village, knowing that Thalorn was safe at last. And though he had fought many battles in his life, this final victory, the defeat of the Drakmir, was the one that would be remembered for generations to come. As for Bryn, the young warrior who had slain the beast. He became a hero in his own right, his name spoken with reverence alongside Kael's. Together, they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, proving that even in the face of the greatest evil, courage and determination could light the way. And so, the village of Thalorn thrived, its people living in peace and prosperity, knowing that the shadows of the mountains no longer held the power to destroy them.